I built a porch swing for my daughter 3 summers ago. Solid white oak, every joint drawboard and pegged, the kind of seat I hoped a grandchild might sit in one day. And I hung the whole thing from a length of hemp rope I bought in a hurry and never once bothered to treat. One cold morning in October, I walked out with my coffee and found it lying face down in the wet grass. The rope had chafed clean through where it rubbed against the beam, and the seat had cracked along a line I had sweated over for a solid week. I had spent all my care on the wood and none of it on the rope. And that, it turned out, was the whole lesson. Because here is a number that stopped me cold the first time I heard it. A single large sailing warship, a first rate of the old British Navy, carried more than 20 miles of rope. On a ship like the Victory, the one still sitting in dry dock at Portsmouth, they reckon it ran closer to 26 miles. Every last foot of it spun and laid and tarred and spliced by hand, by people whose names never made it into the history books. So who on earth made all of it, and how? But this story does not begin on the deck of a warship. It begins in a long, low building most folks have never heard of, called a rope walk. A rope walk is exactly what the name says. It is a covered walkway, sometimes a full quarter of a mile from one end to the other, longer than many a cathedral, and it was built that long for one simple reason. To make a rope strong, you lay the fibers out in a straight line before you ever twist them, and the longer the walk, the longer the rope you could spin in a single unbroken piece. A joint in a rope is a weakness, the same as a joint in a beam, and a rigger did not want weakness holding up a mast in a gale. So they built the whole trade around the length of the thing. Walk into one of the old rope walks that still stand, like the one at the historic dockyard in Chatham, and you feel it in your chest. It goes on and on into the dark, and you understand that rope was never just bought. Rope was made, the way a chair is made, with steps that cannot be skipped. An old rigger I met years ago at a heritage yard over in Essex put it to me plainly while we stood in the doorway of a walk very like it. He said a rope is just a lot of small weak things that have agreed to hold hands and never let go. I have never heard it said better. And when you learn how that agreement is made, you learn something that reaches all the way back into your own bench work. So let me walk you through those steps, because there is a lesson in every single one of them for the work you and I do in the shop. It starts with the fiber. For most of the age of sail that meant hemp, and later manila, which comes from a banana relative grown in the Philippines. Hemp came into the yard in great rough bundles, stiff and tangled and full of woody bits. But before any of that, back on the farm, the cut hemp stalks were left to soak in ponds or laid out in wet fields for weeks, so the soft plant matter would rot away and free the strong fibers inside. That slow rotting has a name of its own. It is called retting, and if you rush it, the fiber stays bound up in the stalk, and if you go too long, the fiber itself begins to rot. It is the same patience a good woodworker learns when he seasons green timber, slowly instead of forcing it dry and watching it check and split. The material sets the pace, not you. Once retted and dried, the hemp arrived at the yard, and only then could it be combed. The workers dragged it across a bed of iron spikes set upright in a board, a tool called a hatchel, and this combing is called hatcheling. It pulls the long fibers straight and parallel and rakes out the short broken ones and the chaff. If you have ever run a cart across raw wool, you know the motion. What you're left with is a soft, gleaming hank of long fibers all lying the same way, ready to be spun. And here is the first thing worth knowing. Hemp is hygroscopic, which is a long word that simply means it drinks moisture straight out of the air, swelling when it is damp and shrinking when it dries. That single trait is the reason my porch swing failed and the reason a rope must be protected, and we will come back to it. Now the spinning. A rope maker would wrap a bundle of those combed fibers around his waist like an apron, hook the ends onto a spinning wheel, and walk slowly backward down the length of the walk, feeding fiber from his own body with his fingers as the wheel twisted it behind him. Backward, step by patient step, a quarter of a mile if the rope demanded it. What he was making was yarn, a single thin twisted thread. That is the smallest building block of every rope on the ship. One man might walk many miles in a single day and have nothing to show for it but yarn. Think about that kind of patience the next time a joint takes you an hour. These men gave a lifetime to it, and their legs knew the length of that walk in the dark without ever counting a step. And if you think that sounds like a lot of work just to make thread, keep watching, because the yarn is only the beginning of the trick. Then comes the part that is pure, quiet genius, and it is the heart of everything. You take a number of those yarns and you twist them together, but here is the trick. You twist the bundle in the opposite direction to the way the individual yarns were spun. The yarns are spun to the right. The strand is twisted to the left. And because each fiber is now fighting to untwist itself, and the twist of the strand is pinning it in place, the whole thing locks against itself and cannot come undone. That opposing twist is called the lay of the rope, and it is why a rope holds itself together with no glue, no nail, nothing but the wood fiber and the tension you built into it. 3 of these strands laid up together once more in the opposite direction again, and you have rope. Fiber spun right into yarn, yarn twisted left into strand, strand laid right into rope, each layer fighting the last, each layer holding the whole. Think about that for a second. There is no fastener in a rope at all. The rope is fastened to itself. That is the same principle as a well-cut wedge or a swelling tree nail, and it is the oldest idea in good craft. Let the material do the holding. Before we go further, a quick word. That trick I just showed you, laying rope so it holds itself together with no fastener, runs right through my book, Secrets of the Shipyard. 150 pages on wooden tree nails, joints that tighten as they age, and the old methods that keep timber alive for centuries. If you want it, scan the code on your screen. Now, a laid rope is a strong thing, but it is not yet a lasting thing. And this is where the rope walk handed off to the next trade. Remember that hemp drinks water. A bare hemp rope, left out in the rain and the salt spray, rots from the inside where you cannot see it, and one gray morning it lets go without warning, same as my swing. So before the standing rigging ever went up a mast, it was soaked and coated in tar, not road tar. This was Stockholm tar, a pine tar cooked slowly from the roots and stumps of pine trees in the great forests of Sweden and the Baltic. It soaks down into the fibers, drives the water out, and seals the rope against rot. It is the very same instinct as brushing linseed oil into an outdoor bench or working tallow into a tool handle. You are not decorating the wood. You are feeding it something that keeps the weather out of its pores. A tarred rope is darker, stiffer, and it will outlast a bare one many times over. The men who did this work went home black to the elbow every night, and the smell of pine tar never fully left them. I keep a tin of pine tar on the shelf above my bench to this day, and the moment I crack the lid, the whole shop smells like a working harbor. It is the smell of things being made to last. If you have never brushed warm pine tar into the end grain of an oak post before it goes in the ground, do it once, and you will never trust a modern sealant the same way again. The old yards were sealing rope against the North Atlantic with it. Your fence post is asking for far less. For a while, tar was enough. It was not enough forever because there were places on the ship where one rope rubbed against another, or ran hard over the edge of a wooden block all day, every day, and no amount of tar stops the slow murder of chafe. So the riggers had a whole set of tricks for that, and every one of them is worth stealing for your own work. First, they would lay thin lengths of old yarn into the grooves of the rope to round it out and fill the hollows, and that is called worming. Then they wrapped the whole thing in strips of tarred canvas, spiraled on like a bandage, and that is called parceling. And finally, they bound it tight, turn by turn, in a tightly wound line pulled as hard as a man could pull, and that is called serving. Worm and parcel and serve. There is even an old rhyme the riggers used to remember which way to spiral it all, so the water would always run off and never in. And every rope end, every single one, was bound off with a tight lashing of small twine, so the whole lay could never start to unravel. That binding is called a whipping, and if I had put one honest whipping and a coat of tar on my daughter's swing rope, that seat would still be hanging today. While the rope makers were spinning and the riggers were serving, a third trade was busy in another corner of the yard entirely, and without them the rope was useless. I am talking about the block makers. A block is what a landsman would call a pulley, a wooden shell with a grooved wheel inside, called a sheave, and the rope runs through it to change direction or to multiply a man's pulling strength. A single first-rate warship needed something on the order of 1,000 blocks. 1,000, each one turned and fitted and pinned by hand, most of them from tough elm and lignum vitae, a wood so dense and so full of its own natural oil that it barely needs greasing and sinks in water like a stone. Threading a rope through a block, by the way, has its own word. It is called reeving, and a rope run through its blocks is said to be rove. Now hold all of that in your head at once. miles of rope, thousands of blocks, and a crew of riggers whose whole job was to marry the two together, high in the air, in the cold, with the ship rolling under them. And here is where all those miles finally sort themselves into sense. The rope on a warship did two completely different jobs, and the sailors gave them two different names. The first is the standing rigging. That is the fixed rope, tarred black and served and set up bar tight, and its one job is to hold the masts up against the pull of the wind. It stands still. It is the skeleton. The second is the running rigging. That is the rope that moves, running up and down through all those thousands of blocks, and it is what the crew hauled on to raise the sails, trim them to the wind, and bring them down again. The standing rigging holds the frame. The running rigging does the work. One is the bones, and one is the muscle, and a ship needed miles of both. Get the standing rigging wrong, and the masts come down in the first real blow. Get the running rigging wrong, and 100 men cannot move a single sail. That is the difference between rope that holds and rope that works, and a good rigger respected both. And there is one lovely detail I promised to come back to. All that standing rigging had to be pulled bar tight and kept tight, and they did it with almost no metal at all. At the foot of each of those heavy ropes sat a round block of hardwood, usually elm, pierced with 3 holes and no wheel inside. It is called a deadeye, and it looks for all the world like a wooden skull, which is likely where the name came from. A lighter line was laced back and forth between 2 deadeyes, over and over through those holes, and then hauled down to draw the whole rig tight, the way you would cinch a bootlace. That lacing line has a name too. It is called a lanyard. So the masts of the mightiest warships on Earth were held upright by wood, fiber, and tension, laced tight through a wooden skull. No turnbuckle, no steel, just the same trust in the material that we started with. So picture the whole thing now. To send one ship to sea, you needed a quarter-mile building and the men who walked backward down it all day making yarn. You needed the spinners and the layers who turned that yarn into 26 miles of rope. You needed the tar cooked from Swedish pine and the men who soaked the rope black. You needed the wormers and the parcelers and the servers who armored every inch that might chafe. You needed the blockmakers turning 1,000 sheaves out of lignum vitae. And you needed the riggers to reeve it all and set it up and send it aloft. Whole trades, whole lives, whole villages, feeding a single hull. And every man of them working wood and fiber with nothing but hand tools and hard-won knowledge. When you stand under the Victory today and look up at that black web against the sky, you are not looking at rope. You are looking at the labor of hundreds of forgotten hands. Which brings me back to my porch swing in the wet grass. I lost that seat because I treated the rope as an afterthought, a thing you buy and forget. The old yards knew better. They knew that the fiber wants to drink water and rot, so you tear it. They knew that rope chafes where it rubs, so you worm and parcel and serve it. They knew that an unbound end unravels, so you whip it. None of that is hard. None of it needs a machine or a modern chemical. It needs only that you respect the material enough to give it what it has always asked for. I rehung that swing on a properly tarred and whipped line the next spring, and my daughter sat on it just last week. Trust the material. Do the old steps. They were never a waste of time. One last thing. If today made you want to build things that outlast you, my book, Secrets of the Shipyard, walks you through it slow and plain. 16 chapters on watertight faying with no drop of glue, on pitch and tallow and linseed oil, and 3 full projects you can build in your own shop this year. The link is waiting for you down in the description. And if you want more of this, subscribe to the Master Shipwright, where we keep the ocean-tested, centuries-lasting ways of working wood alive.